So let's start just with a little bit of a recap on kind of the journey we've rapidly been on with these increasing rates of obesity. And I mean, Susan, to start with you in terms of causality and the main drivers as you see it today.
Well, firstly, let's the elephant in the room, genetics. Genetics are important when it comes to obesity. It's an incredibly polygenic condition. If you look within a population, the reason that some people are bigger than others has got a strong genetic component to it. Absolutely, without a doubt. However, the reason that obesity has quadrupled in the last 30 years in the UK is about changes in our environment. Absolutely no doubt about that. And if we look at around the world, what we see is that the rise in obesity very much mirrors economic development. People leave rural areas, move to urban places, they move away from primary production, they start getting their food, not from their families and their farmers, but from big food. And that is not good for their health. So for me, the food environment, the food industry is the big driver in all of this. Physical activity, yeah, physical activity is really important. You know, nobody's going to tell you that it isn't. There's been a big decline in the UK and elsewhere over time, but that is not what is driving obesity now. You know, physical activity probably hit its nadir maybe 20 years ago when all the manual jobs had gone, everybody had a car, we were all, you know, at screens. Since then, pockets of the population are getting more active. Not everybody, but physical activity is not this. You know, that classic phrase, you cannot outrun a bad diet.
Yeah, that's one quick follow-on before I ask James the same question about, so key part of the problem is energy in and not enough energy out, but particularly energy in. How much of the food problem is, you know, quantity and how much of it is quality and toxicity from food?
It's calories. Obesity is about calories. Now, clearly, some calories are better for you than others, but that is a secondary issue. The obesity issue is about calories. And all of the studies which have, you know, tweaked saturated fat or sugar or fiber, you get small health benefits, valuable, important health benefits. They are as nothing compared to changing calories.
That's pretty clear, I think. James, I mean...
You can do both at once. You can do both at once.
No.
You can have healthy calories.
Fantastic, thank you. James, I mean, from your perspective, you know, causality here, what the roots of the problem, diet, too many calories?
Well, I think that the clinical aspect has been well covered by Susan. I think that there is also a commercial and political aspect to this. The commercial aspect is that these junk foods are extremely addictive. They're very Moorish. Once you get into the habit of eating junk food, it's very difficult to kick it. And your body changes, your brain changes, and trying to come off it is really tough. And the industry has understood this point, and they have cornered the market in a large number of communities, so it becomes extremely difficult to buy anything other than foods that are loaded with fat and sugar, that trigger the physical and emotional response, and continue this cycle of overeating. Now, we've allowed that to happen as a government. The Food Standards Authority, as we know, does not look at nutrition. It only looks at safety. It's the wrong way round. It doesn't try to curate our food environment. And we don't hold back Mondelēzo, Nestlé, and the others from selling chocolate-based cereals at our children. And that was why I was talking about Kit Kat. Your dad's Kit Kat is safe, don't worry. It's the Kit Kat cereal that is trying to create the impression to children that snacking through the day on chocolate is something that is perfectly reasonable and a sensible approach to your health management. This is not a good way to run your life. And uniquely in Britain and America, we have fallen into this trap. We found it very difficult to challenge the commercial companies. In fact, we curate a market for them, both in retail and in the supply chain, that allows them to have these extremely addictive foods targeted at our children. And politically, we've got ourselves caught up into this idea that the British public are so wedded to their donuts and to their chocolate cereals and to their hamburgers that politicians shouldn't try to challenge that. It's almost a source of national pride that we have this food culture around junk. I don't think that is true. I think there's a big political opportunity because families are very worried about the health of their children and the ongoing health of their parents They want their parents to have healthy older lives, which they can't do if they're overweight. It's a big driver of the dementia diseases that we were talking about earlier. And a child who is overweight or obese at the age of 10 has got much poorer outcomes. And if you've got a BMI of over 30 or 35, the chances of you dying with a BMI of under 25 are minuscule, less than 1 in 1,000.
Thank you. And the only thing I would add is just, again, coming back to the rates of childhood obesity and how rapid they've been. I mean, when we started to see those statistics, it struck me that epigenetics might be playing a role. And for those who are not familiar with that concept, I mean, it's one of the ways in which the environment interacts with your DNA. And as Susan was saying, I mean, genetics does play some role, but it's largely the environment. And one of the ways that it has that impact is that it modifies the expression of your genes. And there's a couple of implications of that. One is that, to your point just now, that children who have that programming of their genetics so early on by that environment they're exposed to, it appears to be very hard to unravel that. It's not impossible, but once that your metabolism has been programmed by those early life experiences, it's very hard to unwind. And then the second is that, there is some distressing but scientifically fascinating data suggesting that that there is transmission, epigenetic transmission from parents to children. So in other words, it's not just the food that they're eating, but actually if their parents are overweight, they're able to actually transmit that propensity to obesity to their children. So what you therefore have is these sort of accelerants and this feed-forward loop.
It's not only intergenerational in a genetic sense, it's intergenerational in a behavioural sense. We eat what we like and we like what we eat. And families have eating habits and children learn those from a very, very, very early age.
I suspect most people are feeling hungry about now.
It is also a repeat loop politically. So the government Wes Streeting spoke very movingly about making today's generation of children the healthiest generation in the history of Britain. And that's, I think, a really powerful vision and worked very well, I thought, in the election and resonated really well with parents and the electorate. But bending the curve on obesity means leaning in massively. It means using the full armory that we have, the NHS, the fiscal system, taxes, regulation. It means breaking some of these monopolies that have cornered the market in a lot of communities, in the corner stores and supermarkets, and breaking their hold on the food supply chain. I am worried that I haven't seen anyone with the guts to really do that. I'm not seeing the signals from our government that says that they're prepared to look at the public and say we need to change direction, or to look at the industry and say you need to change the way in which you're doing things. And I think it's worth thinking about what it would take to do that.
Okay, we're into solution mode, rightly so. Susan, I can...
Well, I think the kind of prevention actions that I think James is leaning towards are actually financially cheap. They're very cheap to do. They're politically difficult and politically hard, but they're actually very cheap to do. I think we have to accept that sort of post-Second World War, the government basically said to the food industry, produce more food more cheaply for more people. Yeah. And they did that absolutely brilliantly. They've completely overshot, but government has now got to rein it back in, and they've got to develop some new concordat with the food industry. This is not tobacco. Tobacco, we'd like to put them out of business. We do not want to put the food industry out of business. They're an incredibly important sector for the UK economy. The fact is we just want them to produce different kinds of food. And what we've learned from behavioural science is it's massively easier to change products than to change people. And if you change the products that are on the market, people will follow, because our food industry are fantastic at persuading us. They're brilliant. At the moment, they're persuading us towards the wrong things. So actually, this is a problem we can crack. But as James says, it absolutely needs determination and political commitment to do it.
So maybe I can just unpack that, I think is the phrase, a little bit. Just taking it a little bit more in the round, and feel free to completely say no to all of these, but just looking at the behavioural element of it, let's just consider some of the potential drivers. So what about socioeconomic factors? I mean, we know that health equals wealth, but does it work the other way round? I mean, clearly obesity is not the domain of any one particular socioeconomic group, but prevalence is higher in poorer people. How important is that? In other words, these are cheap calories, and with people for whom food is becoming, with inflation recently, more expensive, is that just going to drive, poorer behaviour? And secondly, linked to that perhaps, is how much is education? I mean, you've kind of said, look, we've got to go for the food industry, and we'll definitely come to that, but how can we kind of educate and empower people and give people access to good calories? Is that possible? Is that part of the solution, and what can we do?
So I think there is definite connection between poverty and obesity, for sure. If you have less money, it is tougher to make healthy choices. You may live in a home that doesn't have a great kitchen. You may live further from a supermarket where it's easier to buy fresh food. You may be hard, if both of you are working, you're looking after kids, you both might be hard pressed to prepare the kind of family meal where you'd expect it to be nutritional and benign. I mean, being poorer is tougher, and junk food is definitely more convenient. It's not directly a price read across. It is perfectly possible to feed a family affordably on fresh food. It is, though, harder and takes more time and is more of a hassle, and the food goes off quicker. So those are access points that we should recognize. But we should also recognize the marketing is absolutely remorseless. If you travel on public transport, if you're plugged into social media, if your children are at school, they are going to be hit by Deliveroo ads from the moment they walk out of school, but certainly my children are. And that reinforces this addictive nature. And you mentioned the component of food that we don't quite understand or can explain. I would just... Although the food industry is not like tobacco in as much we want to get rid of it, we do want to get rid of this bad habit they've got into of chasing down the addictive elements of the food components. That's what's really different about the UK and America to the rest of the world. The junk that we're eating is much more, frankly, addictive than in other countries where there isn't the same correlation between poverty and obesity.
Susan, can I ask, related now to the food industry, your work on the Food Standards Agency, you've been sort of at the leading edge, really, of that battle, shall we call it. Can you share your experience, your sort of frustrations, your wins, the opportunities left?
So sadly, the FSA isn't at the forefront of that because we don't have responsibility for nutrition. We do food safety, and that's a government decision. It was one of the Andrew Lansley changes was to take nutrition out of the FSA and give it to the Department of Health. So this is with ministers. Now, actually, I think that's where it should rest. I think ministers need to be accountable for this. I would say that actually I think that you can use standards to help that policy delivery. But anyway, I in a way don't come at this as being in policy. I come at this as an academic, and having sort of spent 30 years, trying to hammer these points home.
So it's legislate,
Well,
or?
Not necessarily legislation. I mean, some things absolutely will need legislation, but I do think it is this idea of a new concordat with the food industry, where you drive some of it through voluntary measures. There are some companies who are definitely better than others, who are trying to do the right thing, but it is not a level playing field. And so you need a system which makes it a bit more equal. I think we could do much more with, again, theme of today, more data, more monitoring, calling out the bad practice, looking at change over time, incentivizing companies to do the right thing. So it's not all legislation. It's too simplistic to say we can legislate our way out of that. Because what happens with legislation is you pick off very individual policies. Let's restrict advertising. Let's restrict multi-buy promotions. And the food industry just pivots and does it slightly differently. So there's got to be something about shifting the whole enterprise in a different way. So I think we need to be a bit more thoughtful about that.
I would go further than Susan, so I'm a little bit more absolutist than that. Susan is right that if you make micro changes, the industry's smart at getting around it, and I used to be a lobbyist. I know very well how this system works. So we have to be a bit more absolutist about this and give them no space to move. We do have a health emergency. I hate talking in categoric terms like that, but this requires emergency measures. I would be using the fiscal system as we did with the sugary drinks industry levy, to put a big incentive on the industry to reduce the amount of sugar that's in our food, and that's the food that's in our sweets, our children's cereals, and even in our sandwiches. We eat roughly twice as much sugar as a nation as we should, and so let's try and get that down, have a national target, have a concordant with the industry to work towards that. I would do things that, as a conservative, I wouldn't normally be suggesting, like having free school breakfasts and lunches for children in order to educate them on what a decent food is like, because many of them just don't have those meals, don't know what they look like. And I think for a period, we should be committing to that. And I think we should be looking at the monopolies, that, the CMA should be involved at looking at the kind of control these junk food companies have of the supply chain, of the access to the consumer, and the role of marketing in cementing that, and leaning in really hard. I think the ASA should be all over this like a rash and reducing the junk food marketing.
Sorry, one other thing to say, we talk a lot about big food, and they are providing most of the food. But actually, we also, if we ask them to change and we start reducing sugar and salt, which we absolutely should do, but you get into a sort of reformulation mentality, which just tries to make the cake a little bit healthier. Doesn't say we should be eating fewer cakes. So I think we also need to think we need that top down, but we also need a bottom up thing. And there are some fantastic local community initiatives around food, which we need to somehow empower and build on, so that you start to get a sort of cultural shift coming bottom up. And I think that's also going to be important, to reconnect people with food. And I have some reservations about the sort of whole ultra-processed food debate, but one of the things it has done is to catch the imagination of the public. It's made people think again about getting back to ingredients rather than highly, highly processed foods. And I think we need to ride that wave to try to get this cultural shift and re-engagement with real food, for want of a better word.
So just to dig in and get as practical as we can about incentives, I'm hearing incentives for individuals, but also incentives for industry. I mean, let's start with industry. What does that actually look like? I mean, what is the incentive for them to take sugar out of food, which, as you say, is part of the sort of addictive quality of it?
Well, I think Henry Dimbleby makes a good point here, which is that there are all sorts of companies trying to make healthy foods that are delicious, affordable, consumers engage with them, but they are literally crowded out of the market, partly because of the access problem of getting shelf space, and partly because of the addictive nature of a lot of the food that's being pushed, the fried chicken and the sugar-based diet that we've got. If you clear some of that out, other better foods will flourish, as they do in most other countries. So I think there is a benign future not too far on the horizon of many of the same companies, but making better, affordable, fresh food that is good for people and good for their health.
And I don't know the precise figures, I expect you do, in terms of the sort of monopolisation of food provision. I mean, that's such a large percentage is controlled by such a relatively small number of companies. So I guess reducing that monopoly is part.
I'm not sure if this is necessarily a sort of totally a monopoly point. It's the monopolies targeting addictive junk that exercises my concerns, and crowding out all the other. If you go to Hammersmith Tube Station, where there's 10 schools within a kilometre, and you see thousands and thousands of children after school breaks, there isn't a single place for them to eat a nutritious meal there. That's what I mean by crowding out the food system.
Makes sense. Susan, did you have anything on that?
No, I was going to.
So back to people again, because I just feel there's got to be a balance between the two. We somehow have to be better people and have to have a society that's more able to help itself, maybe a little bit more conservative. But Susan, how do we incentivise people? What have you seen? Have you seen things that work?
Well, maybe we could talk a little bit about treatment, because that's where. So I think if you want to prevent, that's a big population level thing. But actually, we also need to think about treatment, because 28% of adults are living with obesity, but 2/3 of people are overweight. And so people need support. And what we know is that providing even quite modest amounts of support to individuals helps them to lose weight. Doing it on your own is really, really tough. And so there's good evidence that intervention programs, things like the National Diabetes Prevention Program, has been a really fantastic success. Reduced the number of people transitioning into diabetes by about 20%. We're now seeing things like the Path to Remission program for people with diabetes. Again, at the end of a year, about a third of them are free of their diabetes. And now, of course, we've got the new obesity drugs, and we really need to think about how we use these in the system in the way that is going to be the most effective, give the best outcomes. And that isn't straightforward.
And we have about 3 minutes left, so I'm going to finish just with the point you made, because I think five minutes. Just to talk a little bit about the drugs, and the reason why I think it's important to capture is that it was mentioned earlier that, you know, if people think, well, it's okay because even if I'm overweight, I can just take a pill and get rid of it. And Richard Meddings earlier on said, you know, there's a very big question because they are successful in many instances. There's a big question for the health service as to how much it goes all in to sort of provide these medications. Pros and cons, risks, benefit.
Well, I think you touched on a very important moral point there, but I would flip it the other way around. I don't think people choose to be overweight. I don't think anyone thinks, oh, well, it doesn't matter if I'm overweight. I think people approach it with huge regret, and they're desperate for support and help, as Susan alluded to. And if they get support and help, they can have a journey to better health. These drugs are presenting a really big moral and economic choice for the country. It is extraordinary that we are spending £213 billion almost entirely on late-stage treatment and intervention on people who have quite developed diseases. And we're turning our back almost completely on public health and the exploitation of these medicines. So there's roughly 400,000 people in the UK at the moment taking fat jabs that they've got from either Boots or online services. There's only 10 or 20,000 people who are on an NHS pathway, because the NHS is taking a very, very conservative approach. Now, there is a degree of pragmatism there. Some of these medicines are going to get a lot better, and the NHS is waiting to see which ones are going to work. But leaning back at a time when we could be helping that very large stock of people who have obesity presents a huge economic challenge, because we've had nearly 1 million people drop out of the workforce, quite a lot of them with an average of 4 morbidities each, often with mental health issues, but also very often with obesity in the mix. So what kind of business sense does it make to be spending 200 billion on treating people with a late-stage disease and backing off both the prevention and also the early-stage treatment of obesity, which economically is so much more valuable and might return people to the workforce so that they could lead productive lives? That's a choice that we should be making right now, and I think puts this issue into the stark reality.
Thank you.
Oh, so much to say about these drugs. Firstly, they are very effective medications, no doubt about that. In the short term, people lose typically 15% of their weight. Maybe we can see a bit more with the new drugs. Richard mentioned earlier that it's estimated 1 in 8 people in the US are using them. What he didn't say is that 50% of people stop within a year. Now, if these are going to work long term, you need to take them long term. That has huge financial implications. But also, will people do that? Medication adherence in general isn't brilliant. Once you stop losing weight, will you carry on taking a weight loss drug? And also, the reason that they work is because they reduce the appeal of food. Food is less rewarding. And lots of people find that isn't how they want to live their lives. It's hugely, profoundly impactful. The problem we also know is that when you stop taking them, weight regain happens, and it happens really fast. So we're all familiar with the idea that people say diets don't work. Diets do work, but when you stop dieting, the weight goes back on. We've done some systematic reviews looking at the rate of weight regain, and after behavioural programs, it takes quite a while, actually, 5 to 10 years to regain the weight you've lost on average. When you stop taking drugs, the weight comes back on very quickly, because you haven't necessarily developed those practical coping strategies. So when the NHS comes to think about this, we need to think not just about providing the drugs, but providing the behavioural support that goes with it as well. That puts up the cost. It has big workforce implications. We need to think about what are we going to do when people stop taking the drugs, because obesity is a chronic relapsing condition. And so they are going to be an incredibly important tool in this portfolio. But I think at the moment we're at sort of peak enthusiasm for this, and we're going to discover that they have a place, but it's a much smaller place than perhaps we want to believe.
Thank you very much.